I woke with a piercing headache and a heavy sense of disorientation, as if I'd been in a deep sleep for an entire day. The oppressive heat and tangled sheets around my legs gave me the impression that something was terribly off. As I slowly turned my head, I caught sight of Thomas lying beside me. My mind staggered at the sight, a surreal and unthinkable reality I couldn't accept. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and my heart hammered wildly in my chest. Thomas, still emerging from sleep, blinked in shock. His eyes were wide as if he'd just been scorched by a sudden flame. Every moment felt both painfully real and nightmarishly distant. "Why are you here?" I managed to ask in a trembling whisper, my voice laden with disbelief. Thomas reached up, almost in a daze, running his hand over his face as if trying to piece together fragments of a shattered memory. I don't know," he stuttered, his words barely coherent. Even though I was dressed in my usual clothes, which should have provided comfort, it only deepened the surreal horror of the situation. The disarray of my memories and the conflicting reality left me feeling nauseous with a deep sense of revulsion. Those initial moments were like a waking nightmare, each second dragging on as I struggled to comprehend what had transpired. The room felt oppressively small, every sound, the gentle ticking of a clock, the distant murmur of morning light, reminding me of the unrelenting tension that bound me to this horrifying scene. I desperately tried to grasp onto something familiar, but the events of the previous night seemed fragmented and elusive. My thoughts spiraled as I questioned how I could possibly have ended up in this predicament, with Thomas so uncomfortably close and an overwhelming sense of dread choking me. The scattered memories of that fateful night offered no clear explanation. Instead, they left behind a lingering haze of uncertainty and fear. With each heartbeat, I felt more trapped by the relentless barrage of questions with no answers in sight. Realizing I could no longer remain in that suffocating atmosphere, I decided that I had to get away. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape as I gingerly lifted my legs, despite their numbness, and moved towards the door. Each step was an act of defiance, a silent plea for freedom from the inescapable grip of that night's events. I made sure not to look back, unwilling to confront the tormented gaze of Thomas or the unspoken secrets his expression held. Later, as I found myself in the brightness of the kitchen clutching a cup of coffee, the fragments of the previous night continued to haunt me. I recalled coming home under the influence, but I couldn't reconcile how I had ended up in bed with Thomas. Staring into the dark, swirling coffee, I searched for some narrative that could make sense of the chaos, yet only found more confusion. Even checking my phone, hoping for any message or missed call that might explain what had happened, yielded nothing but a blank screen. The deafening silence of my notifications only deepened my growing unease, leaving me to wonder whether my memories were playing tricks on me or if something far more sinister had occurred. Before I could sink any further into my troubled thoughts, Thomas entered the kitchen. His presence, so casually unannounced, sent another jolt of anxiety through me. Although his face appeared calm at first, every subtle movement betrayed an inner turmoil. I met his gaze, silently demanding an explanation, but his eyes offered only a glimpse of uncertainty. "I'm sorry," he began quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were apologizing for a mistake he couldn't fully comprehend. I couldn't hold back the surge of anger and confusion that welled up inside me. "Explain yourself," I demanded sharply, my tone a mix of fear and indignation. "How did we end up here?" Thomas exhaled deeply, running his hand through his hair in a futile attempt to gather his thoughts. "I woke up in your bed. I don't remember everything clearly," he murmured, his voice wavering with regret and confusion. His uncertain words only added to the dissonance between what I felt and what I remembered from the previous night. The more he tried to recall, the more I sensed that he was as lost in his recollections as I was. My mind, already reeling from the shock, could not accept half-formed explanations. It seemed as if every detail of that night had disintegrated into a haze of broken memories and unanswered questions. The room was thick with an uncomfortable silence, a silence that screamed of secrets too painful to confront. In that fraught moment, it became painfully clear that the events of that night were more than just a lapse in judgment or the result of excessive drinking. There was a darker undercurrent, something that had crossed an invisible line I never thought would be breached. The raw intensity of that realization sparked an unyielding resolve within me. I had to leave this place, far away from the chaos and the unbearable uncertainty that clung to every word Thomas uttered. I couldn't wait for further explanations or justifications. Every instinct told me that remaining there would only worsen the situation. With trembling determination, I stepped away from the suffocating confines of the room. The cool morning air hit my face as I crossed the threshold, a stark reminder that while the night had ended, its haunting echoes would persist. My entire being resonated with the urgency to reclaim control over my life, a life now irrevocably altered by events too horrifying to fully comprehend. As I moved further from that nightmare, a profound sense of loss began to take hold. I could no longer recall the clear outlines of my past. Everything seemed blurred and unreachable, as if a vital piece of my identity had been erased. Yet, amidst the disorientation, one thought remained resolute. I needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful or unsettling it might be. The disjointed memories and the deep-seated dread that enveloped me were a constant reminder that nothing would ever be the same. In the stillness of that early morning, I felt both the weight of my shattered reality and a flicker of determination. I had no idea what lay ahead, but I knew that the quest for truth was unavoidable. The haunting fragments of that night had set me on a path I could neither predict nor escape, a path that demanded I confront the darkest corners of my mind. And so, with every hesitant step, I moved away from the life I once knew, driven by a desperate need to piece together the puzzle of that fateful night. Even as I walked away, the room behind me, with its heavy silence and lingering shadows, seemed to whisper that the nightmare was far from over. The memory of Thomas's perplexed expression, the uncertainty in his voice, and the overwhelming feeling of betrayal were not easily left behind. Instead, they became the catalyst for a new resolve to reclaim my life and my sanity, however painful the journey might be. I knew that I couldn't run from the truth forever. Somewhere within the tangled threads of my recollections lay answers that I needed to confront, no matter how harrowing. But for now, all I could do was escape the oppressive confines of that room and the unspoken horrors it contained, setting my feet on a path toward clarity and self-preservation. After fleeing the stifling room, I wandered through the dim corridors of the house, the chill of early morning clinging to my skin. Even as I tried to distance myself from the oppressive memories, I could not escape the lingering presence that awaited me. Returning to the hallway, I found Thomas standing there, leaning casually against the wall as if he had expected my return. His eyes tracked every movement I made, and his expression, an unsettling mix of nonchalance and suppressed tension, made it clear that our night's events were far from resolved. "Where are you heading at this hour?" he asked in a soft, almost mocking tone. There was an insinuation in his voice, as if he believed I owed him some explanation for leaving abruptly. The casual nature of his question only deepened the knot of anger and fear that had taken root inside me. I paused, forced to confront him rather than simply retreating further into the night. "What do you want from me, Thomas?" I managed, my voice trembling with equal parts defiance and vulnerability. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately closing the distance between us. The air seemed charged, every inch between us heavy with unspoken implications. "Perhaps you should explain why you bolted after everything happened," he said, his tone carrying an unsettling calm as he searched my face for some reaction. My heart hammered as I struggled to organize my thoughts. Vague, disjointed memories of blurred images and fleeting sensations swirled in my mind, but nothing coalesced into a coherent picture. "I just needed space," I replied at last, my voice low and wavering. I couldn't face what happened. I couldn't tell if it was an excuse or the truth, but it was all I had in that moment. Thomas's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Space, or maybe an attempt to hide from the truth," he countered, his words soft yet piercing. His insinuation left me feeling as if every step I took was monitored by an unseen force, a reminder that I couldn't simply run from what was unfolding. Before I could muster another reply, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the charged silence. The front door creaked open, and an unexpected presence entered the scene, a presence that felt like a lifeline. Jessica, my mother, appeared in the doorway, her eyes immediately shifting between Thomas and me. In her steady gaze, I found a measure of calm, a reassurance that I was not alone in facing this nightmare. "What is going on here?" Jessica asked in a firm yet gentle tone, her eyes locking onto Thomas with a mixture of concern and quiet authority. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself as I watched Thomas's face fall into uncertainty. His earlier defiance was replaced by a fleeting moment of vulnerability as he tried to avoid her scrutinizing look. I glanced between them, my heart torn between relief at Jessica's arrival and the persistent dread that clung to every memory of the night before. "We need to talk about what happened," I said, my voice carrying a blend of anger and sorrow. I couldn't hide the tremor in my words, a raw admission that something terrible had occurred. Jessica's eyes softened as she turned her attention to me. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern etched in every syllable. I nodded, although inside I felt as if I were unraveling. Her presence brought a semblance of order to the chaos, but it also laid bare the painful reality we now faced. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions and a shared sense of betrayal. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice subdued as he tried to piece together his own recollections. I remember parts of it," he began haltingly. "It's all very hazy and confusing." His confession sounded as though he were as much a prisoner of his fragmented memories as I was. Every pause and uncertain gesture deepened the chasm between our versions of that night. Jessica's tone grew firm. "Thomas, this isn't a matter to be taken lightly. I need to know exactly what happened." Her words, though measured, carried the weight of authority that could no longer allow us to skirt around the truth. Caught between anger and despair, I recalled the conflicting images of the night, the fragments that hinted at boundaries crossed and promises betrayed. "I can't just forget what I remember feeling," I said softly, my voice breaking. "There's too much I don't understand." It was an admission of vulnerability, and every word felt like a dagger to the already aching fragments of my memory. For a long, heavy moment, we stood in silence. The morning light seeped through the windows, casting long, uncertain shadows on the floor. Thomas's eyes shifted nervously, as if the realization of his actions was finally dawning on him. "Maybe there was something more, between us that night," he ventured quietly, his tone laced with an ambiguity that made my blood run cold. I felt a surge of revulsion and disbelief. "That isn't something you can simply brush off," I snapped, my voice rising with emotion. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Every word was loaded with the weight of the unspoken accusations that had tormented me since I awoke. Before Thomas could answer, the atmosphere in the room became almost unbearable. Jessica's steady, authoritative presence reminded us both that this conversation was far from a casual debate. "This behavior is unacceptable," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You need to leave, Thomas. Now." Her command left no room for argument. In that moment, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Thomas's defiance melted into a look of reluctant resignation. His eyes, once filled with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty, now shimmered with the dawning awareness of the consequences of his actions. The sanctity of our home, the very place that once promised safety and comfort, had been shattered. With a heavy heart, I began to gather my belongings. Each movement was deliberate, every action underscored by the painful finality of my decision to leave. I knew that staying any longer would only trap me further in this tangled web of betrayal and half-remembered horrors. As I stepped out of the house, the cool morning air greeted me, offering a brief but welcome respite from the stifling tension I was leaving behind. The drive that followed was a blur, a storm of emotions and fractured thoughts battling for clarity. I replayed every conversation, every conflicted glance, and every word of regret in my mind, searching for some meaning in the chaos. Even as the miles passed beneath the wheels of my car, Thomas's presence lingered like a shadow I could neither shake nor ignore. I eventually found refuge in a small, secluded park where the early sun began to cast a gentle glow over the landscape. Parking my car beneath the budding light, I sat on a weathered bench, trying to make sense of the tumult that had become my life. In that quiet, isolated space, the full weight of the previous night pressed down upon me, a relentless reminder that my world had been irreparably altered. I knew that the unanswered questions, the jagged edges of my memory, and the betrayal I felt would continue to haunt me until I faced them head-on. The truth lay hidden among the shattered fragments of that night, and I resolved to piece them together, no matter how painful the process might be. In that moment of solitude, as the world around me began to stir with the promise of a new day, I realized that the path ahead would be as uncertain as it was necessary. There was a part of me that craved closure, a desperate need to reclaim the narrative of my own life. But the journey promised to be fraught with both peril and the possibility of healing, a duality that left me trembling at the edge of despair and hope. Jessica's intervention had not only forced Thomas out of our shared space, but had also marked the beginning of a new chapter for me. Though the lingering presence of that night would forever cast its shadow, I vowed to seek out the truth, to confront the memories I had long tried to suppress. The road ahead was uncharted, filled with emotional scars and daunting uncertainties, yet it was one I had to traverse if I ever hoped to reclaim the life I once knew. As I sat there on that worn bench, the early sunlight warming my face, I took a deep breath. The quiet of the park, punctuated only by the distant hum of morning activity, seemed to whisper a promise that amidst the chaos, there lay a chance for redemption. Even if the truth was buried deep within the fragmented shards of that night, I would find it, and with it, the power to rebuild a sense of self that had been shattered. With renewed determination, I stood up and stepped away from the bench, leaving behind the painful echoes of the confrontation. The drive ahead was not just an escape, but the beginning of a journey toward clarity, healing, and ultimately, a reclaiming of my identity. Even as the unanswered questions and haunting memories threatened to overwhelm me, I knew that I could no longer allow myself to remain trapped in that web of uncertainty. The truth, however elusive, beckoned, and I was ready to follow its call, no matter where it might lead. In the days that followed, the world around me felt as if it were draped in a perpetual haze. Every moment was tinged with the memories of that dreadful night, and the quest for answers became a constant companion in my daily life. I found myself unable to shake off the disquieting feeling that the truth lay hidden within those fragmented recollections, a truth that was both elusive and profoundly unsettling. I returned to my apartment, now an empty shell that echoed with every step I took. The familiar corners, once imbued with a sense of home and safety, now seemed to harbor shadows of doubt and despair. Every room whispered its own secrets of the past, reminders of the unspeakable events that had shattered my sense of normalcy. As I began the arduous process of trying to piece together my memories, the uncertainty of that night continued to gnaw at my mind. I spent hours sifting through old photographs and messages on my phone, searching for any clue that might explain how things had spiraled so disastrously out of control. There were moments when I felt as if the answers were tantalizingly close, only to slip away like fragments of a forgotten dream. The absence of clear evidence weighed heavily on me. In one particular moment of solitude, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, staring blankly at the screen of my laptop as I scrolled through a series of blurred snapshots of happier times. They served as a stark contrast to the dark, confusing reality I now faced. I began to wonder if these memories, once so cherished, were now just a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Late one afternoon, while wandering the quiet streets of the city, I stumbled upon a small, almost forgotten cafe. The inviting warmth emanating from its windows beckoned me to enter, and I decided that a change of scenery might help me find some clarity. As I settled into a corner seat, I allowed myself a brief moment of reprieve, sipping on a bitter espresso and listening to the soft murmur of conversations around me. Yet even in this seemingly mundane setting, my thoughts returned to that night and to Thomas. The images of his pained expression and conflicted eyes haunted me. I recalled the ambiguous fragments of his recollection, the vague hints that there might have been an intimacy, a crossing of boundaries that defied my expectations and moral understanding. Determined to confront my growing need for closure, I began to keep a journal. Each night, I wrote down every detail I could remember, no matter how insignificant it seemed at the time. I documented my emotions, my doubts, and even the smallest sensory details, a faint perfume lingering in the air, the sound of my own footsteps echoing down empty hallways. Through this process, I hoped to assemble a clearer picture, to find meaning in the chaos of fragmented memories. Sometimes, in the quiet solitude of the night, I would reread my entries, searching for connections that might have slipped past me in the initial haze of confusion. It was during these moments that the pain of the night returned in waves, a visceral reminder of how deeply everything had changed. At the same time, I found myself caught in a relentless cycle of anger and betrayal. Every interaction with Thomas, whether in passing or in forced conversation, stirred up emotions that I had long tried to suppress. The tension between us had grown into an unspoken war, with each of us guarded behind a facade of uncertainty. There were instances when Thomas would try to approach me, his voice tentative as he attempted to offer explanations or apologies that never fully satisfied the truth I was desperate to uncover. I learned to keep my distance, preferring instead to immerse myself in the search for clarity rather than engage in another painful dialogue. One evening, after an exhausting day of reviewing my scattered thoughts and documents, I decided to visit a local support group. The idea of sharing my experience with strangers was daunting, but I hoped that by talking to others who had faced similar betrayals and uncertainties, I might begin to heal. In a quiet community center room, I listened as people recounted stories of loss, betrayal, and the long road to reclaiming control over their lives. Their voices, laden with both sorrow and resilience, resonated deeply with me. It was in that circle of empathetic strangers that I first began to understand that the journey to find the truth was as much about reconciling with myself as it was about confronting external events. During one particularly emotional session, I found the courage to speak about the elusive memories of that night. I described the raw terror, the conflicting sensations of revulsion and yearning for answers, and the overwhelming sense of being caught in a reality that refused to make sense. The supportive nods and quiet murmurs from the group reminded me that I was not alone, that the process of healing involved accepting the fragments of my past, no matter how painful they might be. Though the conversation did not provide any definitive answers, it did offer a small measure of solace. I left the meeting with a cautious hope that perhaps, in time, the truth would become less of a burden and more of a stepping stone toward reclaiming my life. At home, the silence was a constant reminder of the void left by those unresolved questions. I began to notice small triggers, an offhand remark by a friend, a familiar tune on the radio, that sent my thoughts spiraling back to that night. Each time, I forced myself to take deep breaths, grounding my awareness in the present, even as the past threatened to overtake me. I made a conscious effort to fill the days with activities that reaffirmed my sense of identity, long walks in the park, creative writing sessions in my journal, and even trying my hand at painting, using color as a way to express emotions that words could not capture. One rainy afternoon, as I sat by my window watching droplets race down the glass, I received a message from an old acquaintance who had once known Thomas. The message was vague and offered little comfort, but it hinted that Thomas might be struggling with his own demons. This revelation stirred a complex mixture of emotions in me. Part of me felt a spark of compassion for him, a recognition that perhaps he, too, was caught in a web of guilt and regret. Yet, another part of me remained steadfast in my resolve that the responsibility for healing lay firmly on my own shoulders. I responded briefly, wishing him well, but also maintaining the distance I had so carefully established. As days turned into weeks, the rhythm of my life began to settle into a tentative equilibrium. The memories of that harrowing night, though never completely erased, became less of a constant terror and more of a shadow that I learned to navigate. I still sought the truth with relentless determination, but gradually I also began to understand that some mysteries might never be fully unraveled. The process of accepting uncertainty became part of my journey toward healing. In quiet moments, as I sat alone with my thoughts and my journal, I reflected on the profound transformation I had undergone. The pain, the betrayal, and the unresolved questions had all contributed to reshaping who I was. I had learned that true strength was not the absence of fear or uncertainty, but the courage to face them head-on, even when the answers were murky and incomplete. It was in that acceptance that I found a glimmer of hope for rebuilding a life that had once seemed irreparably broken. The journey was far from over. Each day brought new challenges and unexpected revelations, both about the past and about myself. I knew that the search for truth would continue to be a winding path, filled with setbacks and small victories alike. Yet, with every step I took, I felt a growing sense of resolve to reclaim the narrative of my life, no matter how dark the memories or how elusive the answers might be. In that resolve, I discovered that the act of questioning, of seeking, was in itself a form of healing. Even as the shadows of that fateful night lingered in the corners of my mind, I was learning to forge a future where the pain of the past no longer dictated my every move. The commitment to uncovering the truth, coupled with the determination to move forward, became the guiding force of my existence, a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, one could find the strength to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, I slowly began to piece together the shattered fragments of my past, realizing that some mysteries might never be fully unraveled. I found a fragile balance between the lingering pain of that night and the hope that each new day could offer a chance to rebuild. Every morning, as I stepped out into the world, I reminded myself that the darkness of memory did not have to dictate my future. With each tentative step, I started to reclaim my identity, one forged through both vulnerability and quiet strength. There were still moments when the echoes of that fateful night would surge back unexpectedly, a stray word, a familiar scent, a soft note of a song, and for a brief instant, I would be pulled into a maelstrom of fear and regret. But over time, I learned that healing was not a linear process. It meant acknowledging the pain, accepting that some questions might remain unanswered, and choosing to move forward anyway. My journey led me to unexpected places, a local support group where I found solace in shared stories, long walks in the park that allowed my thoughts to settle, and quiet evenings spent writing in my journal. Through these small acts, I began to understand that the search for truth was as much about self-discovery as it was about confronting the past. I realized that every scar, every moment of betrayal, had taught me something essential about resilience and the capacity to forgive myself. As I closed that tumultuous chapter, I vowed not to be defined solely by the horror of one night, but to embrace the strength that emerged from the struggle. Though shadows would always linger in the corners of my memory, they no longer controlled my every step. I was determined to create a future where I could feel safe again, a future built on the foundation of hard-won insight, compassion, and the unyielding resolve to reclaim my life. In this newfound clarity, I discovered that the act of moving forward was not a denial of the past, but a tribute to the power of survival. With each breath, I embraced the possibility of renewal, knowing that while the journey ahead might be fraught with challenges, it was also illuminated by the promise of healing and transformation.